Thank you, Desmond. I'm just going to speak from here so I don't have to speak to people's backs, if you don't mind. Again, thank you for having me. And there's no question. For all the technology-driven changes that we are seeing, social, mobile, etc., I think the impact of big data and the implications of big data on society as we know it is going to have the most profound implications. So I think it's appropriate that we're spending a lot of time thinking about what this means for all of us. I thought I'd make my comments in three parts. First, I want to make the statement, it's a little controversial, but I want to make the statement that the nature of big data means that traditional forms of control, whether it's notice and consent, Jacqueline spoke of, or privacy or security, etc., is just not viable. I don't think data can be controlled. I don't think you have any choices except to be thinking of open data platforms, because it just cannot be done. Second, I want to say that there is tremendous value in big data. So even if you could control it, I think it is suboptimal to try and control it, not just for public services and public goods, the kind of things you talked about, Jacqueline, but also for the capacity of private sector and private firms to create better opportunities, better outcomes for individuals. And third, I want to talk about, given that I make these controversial statements, but on the other side, given the compelling human need for privacy and fairness and making sure that you're not being disenfranchised, the only answer can be in the evolution of legal, ethical, and social norms around usage, and the kinds of usage you can put data to, and which is not easy and straightforward, but it seems to me that that's probably the only path down which we can collectively go. Now, these are abstract things. I will pepper my comments with constant references to banking, which I know best, and to some of the things we see as we embark around our digital and big data-driven journey as well. So let me start with the first. And why do I think it's really not possible to control? And I'll go back to the three V's: volume, variety, velocity. If you think about the volume of data, there's somewhere 3-4 zettabytes. I didn't even know what a zettabyte was. It's 1 followed by 21 zeros. Mind-boggling. But there's tons of stuff. It's easy to store. You can store it on a grain of rice. I see it in my bank. In the past, we used to struggle with how many months of statements do we keep online. Do we capture all your credit card transactions? Every time you go to an ATM, do I want to store it or not? Because the cost of storage was high. Today, it is not consequential. Today, I can store, and I'm storing. So you should all be aware. I'm storing every transaction you do on the ATM, every transaction that comes in your bank account, every time you use a credit or debit card, every time you interface with the bank, I'm storing all of it. Right? And that volume of data I'm storing does not cost me anything much to store. It has become so cheap that I just keep tons of it. And I keep tons of it in structured and unstructured form. And because of the power of Hadoop and the power of being able to do large-scale, large computing search, I don't even need to structure it anymore. I keep text. I keep language. I keep the stuff you write in your text fields of money. I keep all of it. Right? And I keep all of it, and I now have the capacity to read all of it. So I don't even need to say what is my data structure and so on. We talked about Watson. Watson needs unstructured data. I can read every text. Right? So the volumes that we are keeping, and I'm one bank, you multiply that by multiple banks, institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So the volume change is dramatic. Right? The second, variety. So people talk about a large chunk of digitally born data. You can create data on every website you go, every database you go. Increasingly, analog born data is not just in the realms of the future. So we are using cameras, we are using wearable data, and now I have a plan to put sensors, sort of like I do sensors everywhere. It cost me $8 to get a sensor, right? I can litter sensors all over the country at my own expense and capture every location, every movement that any of you want. We're putting sensors in cabs, we're putting sensors in our branches, we're putting sensors out there because I want to capture your physical movements and your analog data. right? I've always been able to capture that. So every time you go to an ATM and withdraw cash, I know where you are. I know what you did. Every time you go to a retail department store and swipe your debit card and credit card, I know where you are, and I know what you did. Right? Every time you walk past any of the cameras I've installed, certainly in my branches and on top of my ATM machines, I know where you are and I know what you did. Right? And because I'm working with biometrics at the same time, I'm increasingly beginning to identify you by face, and I know who you are when you go past my camera. Right? So the variety of analog-driven data, it exists today. You add to that machine-born data. So Internet of Things we talked about, right? So car and washing machine, etc. is okay. Car will send data, washing machines. I'm getting it from ATMs. So one of the most, I'll talk about example, my ATM is sending me data all the time on usage, right? And which allows me to preventive maintenance, for example. Like I said, I'm already capturing data from other kinds of this thing, and we're trying to figure out how we can capture data from other kind of Fitbit devices. So I'm getting data from machines. Is data created by you, but it's also data created about you. So I'm getting all of that data. And frankly, on top, I'm getting data about data. I'm getting metadata. So I'm keeping and tracking, I'm keeping track of the phone numbers, I'm keeping track of the numbers you have, your own numbers, I can keep track of the numbers you're dialing, and keep track of your IP address, I can keep track of, locational data. Now, I'm not keeping track of all of that yet, but it's very easy, and as we think about a digital future, digital bank, we're already thinking about how we can keep track of all of the realms of data. So a variety. When you talk about velocity of data, so it's easy. We track all click streams. So anybody on any of our sites all the time, anyway, we track it. So we know instantly what you're clicking, which is why when you click something, I know what you click, I can respond right away. So it's in real time. But increasingly, I'm also doing that with location data. Location data is really important. You can do location configuration many ways. I can use GPS. We can use cell phone triangulation. We're working with telcos to do cell phone triangulation. We can do Wi-Fi network mapping, and then we can always use our own point of sales terminals and ATMs, right? But when you put all of that together, I have tremendous capacity to narrow down to a few feet where you are in real time. Why is that relevant? Jacqueline gave the example of Google Maps. You want that data because, any mapping data needs real-time velocity-specific data. But a lot of the stuff that I can do requires that. I need to know where you are and what you're doing. If I want to do banking in context, then I need to have location. What does banking in context mean? I need to know what you're doing with your life at a point in time, and I need to be able to give you the right service at the right time. So I need to have that kind of locational data. Now you think about that. You think about volume, variety, and velocity. I'm one bank. I already have capacity for volume, variety, and velocity, which is so mind-boggling and so immense, it is impossible to put controls around it. And then you multiply it by companies, governments, institutions. And so my basic thesis is just expanding and growing so rapidly and so fast that in real practical terms, I don't think it is really possible to control. Data is quite ubiquitous. Today we are working with people to figure out, it invades private spaces. Your Wi-Fi signal can tell me, so we're not sure how to use it yet, but how many people are there in the house at a point in time, or how many people are in a room. The car data can tell me whether you have a kid in the car or not, so I know what kind of offers to send you. Should I send you a McDonald's 20% off thing or not? I already talked about facial recognition data, which allows me to identify this thing. So, data is ubiquitous. It is also, it's not anonymous. You anonymize it, we encrypt data, we ask people to this thing, etc. But what Jacqueline mentioned is true. The power of re-identifying is actually quite strong. So even if you're completely anonymous, just by throwing tons of computer power at it and throwing tons of different things that are happening, I can start narrowing it down to who could this person be, right? So first this thing, that of the last point mentioned, I think ownership. Think about ownership is impossible. There are the examples of 4 people in a photograph or in a video who owns the data. We struggle with it in our credit card business the whole time, right? Your credit card data, does it belong to the user? Does it belong to the bank who gave you the credit card to use? Does it belong to MasterCard and Visa, which is the scheme that uses this thing? Does it belong to the merchant who acquired this thing? Who actually has rights in this thing or the data? And the truth is today, the way the system works, almost everybody down the chain is a legitimate owner of a part of the data. It's very tough to identify who should or should not have that data. So that's my first comment. I think the world we are going in, any artificial constructs or trying to put in barriers or ring fences or walled gardens or will protect, I think is short-lived. I don't think it can really work. My second point is, even if you could figure some very clever ways to do it, I'm not sure it is really in the advantage of mankind and the advantage of citizens, recognizing the downsides of it. Again, Jacqueline and show people yesterday spoke about governments and agencies and public use of data. And so whether it's for, peace and security or healthcare or, a whole bunch of very laudable objectives. You think about healthcare, I was quite intrigued. I was reading once that you think about identification of cholera in the 1800s, a guy called John Snow. And he finally nailed down cholera and its root cause just doing data analysis in cholera clusters in London, where cholera clusters are happening and using. It's the first precursor of using big data and patterns to try and narrow down on something. So you load that to genetics and you load that to efficiency and so on. There's a whole bunch of upside you can get from data. Watson is an artificial intelligence machine, which is IBM's biggest investment in a long, long time. So IBM's traditionally had 3 service lines, hardware, software, and services. For the first time in some 50 or 70 years, they've created a 4th service line, which is artificial intelligence, Watson. What Watson does is, I guess it does a lot of things, but 2 things as a layman. One, it reads unstructured text. So it can read plain English. And it can understand the context of that unstructured text. So unlike Google, which basically works on patterns and so on, Watson does a much better job understanding the context of the text it reads. The second thing Watson does is cognitive, so it keeps improving all the time. IBM put Watson to work first with oncology at Sloan Kettering. So they worked with Sloan Kettering doctors and taught Watson over a 2-year period to do cancer diagnosis. What IBM tell me today, and which seems to be borne out by a lot of researchers, Watson's ability today to diagnose cancer is at par with the best oncologists in the world, if not better. Why? Watson reads every cancer case. Anyway, I mean, it reads the data, it reads the literature, it reads the academia, and it reads the empirical case studies. So when you go to Watson and say, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 symptoms, Watson knows what to go and match it against, track it in real time, big part, and say, you know what, I've seen this before, this is probably the diagnosis of the cancer you have. So you think about the dramatic improvements in things like healthcare you can drive with big data. You can do the same thing, obviously, with security and safety. You think about not just surveillance tools, but facial recognition tools, right? So to be able to figure out the upside is obviously very, very powerful, weather, energy, use of energy in buildings, lights on, lights off, a whole bunch of stuff. In the private sector in our bank, I want to give you 5 specific examples of how we use big data to great advantage of our clients and our customers and what they get from us. Sometimes, and you run with this question, though, is it really in the interest of a specific customer or not? So the first is fraud detection. Right? So we increasingly use big data not just on us, i.e. what is happening, etc., but of us data, to try and figure is fraud likely to occur or is fraud occurring. And we do that partly because regulators require us to do that. We're supposed to have anti-money laundering and terrorism and sanction systems. We've created massive systems, and in those systems, we track patterns. So we look at your own patterns of behavior, and then we look at patterns of behavior of people like you. So you are a salaried person, we should expect you to get credits, once a month in your account. We should expect you to make debits of the following type. Other people like you do the following stuff. And our computers are constantly comparing your transaction profile with what we think your profile should be and what others like you do. And if there's something which is out of the ordinary, it throws it up. And show it up saying, hey, there's something wrong. Why would this person have a transaction of this sort? Right? Now, we do that, it is effective. It throws up for me, and I've got to fine-tune the system very country. If it throws up 1% of transactions as odd, I can't handle it because the volumes are too huge. So I need to refine it to getting down to decimals of a percent. On the other hand, if I don't do it, apart from my own sense of security and making sure we have the right transactions, if I don't do it, regulators around the world get on our case because they expect us to do this. right, to be able to do this from a fraud protection standpoint. But it also helps you. One of the biggest sources of fraud is, as an example, is credit card or ATM card. So what the crooks do is they they capture your details when you use it in ATM or they capture it online. They put the details on another piece of plastic and then they go and use them typically in Bulgaria, Romania or Mexico, right? Big data gives me a very simple thing. If my location data tells me that you are in Singapore and I know right now you're at Takashima shopping, whereas the credit card was used in Bulgaria, I know this likely not to be you. So we're using big data to be able to track fraud and to be able to track fraud patterns and fraud recognition. Second area we use, now you could argue to Jackie's point. So if I do this and capture fraud and the perpetrator of the fraud will say, hey, you shouldn't have used the data to capture me or identify that I was frauding. I'd say by and large, society as a whole and my customers are quite happy with the fact that I'm doing this. So not an issue. Secondary place where we use a lot of big data, though, starts getting to be a little more tricky. We use big data in credit decisioning. So in the past, our credit decisioning for individuals and individual companies was based on individual analytics. So a credit underwriter would look at your situation, track your income, track your profile, track what you did, and decide how much credit was appropriate to give you. Right? Today, I can use data and algorithms as well as your own track record. Do you pay your electricity bills on time? Did you pay your house rent on time? How many missed payments did you have? And create credit profiling which tells me you are more risky than you are. Your track record is likely to be worse than your track record. Now, in the past, banks have been doing this now for several years through credit bureaus. So we all feed data into credit bureaus. Credit bureaus use this and do scoring. But even the evolution of data in credit bureaus was nuanced. It started with negative bureaus. So all you were allowed to say is the person a good credit risk or a poor credit risk? It moved to positive bureaus, where now you're allowed to actually get data saying each month did the person make the payment or not make the payment. So you get positive information. Right? We have taken it to the next level. It's not just bureau data, it is every piece of transaction and activity that you do. I know from your card information, are you paying your bills on time? Are you paying not only your credit card bill, but are you paying your sink power bill, your electricity bill, your debt in other banks? And therefore, that allows me to develop a whole profile pattern saying, are you risky or not? What does that let me do? First, it lets me make more intelligent credit decisions. It allows me to price for risk. So I can charge a more risky person higher than a less risky person. It allows me to improve the credit I give a less risky person. I can give you more credit at a cheaper price. That's obviously something the less risky person likes. But why is it tricky? It starts impinging on traditional questions of fairness. We as society have driven a view in the past that everybody should have equal access to credit or healthcare or insurance. So this use of big data, which I think is appropriate, it allows me to manage my business better, it allows me to give the better customers, better price and better features, but it could disadvantage individual customers because I know that they're not as good. There you start getting into realms of is it relatively the right thing to do or not. Equipment monitoring, I told you, I said equipment monitoring, we use our ATMs. This is the first thing we did last year. We're the first company that I believe, it's like who was saying just now that they did it with Boeing in their previous life. So we've got sensors now, intelligent sensors on our ATM machines. Our biggest problems with our ATM machines and our cash deposit machines used to be that our uptime levels were in the 95–97% range, which is okay, but 3% of the time you went to an ATM or a cash machine, it was down. That's very frustrating. Right? With our sensors now, we can sense way ahead of time which machine is likely to go down, right? Because we get regular data feeds from the various parts in the machine. We get data feeds on the number of times the part is, or the machine has been used. We get data feeds also which tell us the velocity of transaction, the peaks and troughs. So we've changed our entire machine refueling times. We know exactly when to send the vans out instead of waiting for the machine to this thing. And we know when to replace parts ahead of time. Our uptime levels have gone up to the 99.9% levels purely because we've been able to use data intelligently around machine-generated data. So, that's obviously a straightforward one. Working capital management. So what we do now in our SME business, we've started collecting data from every client of ours, including non-clients, Bloomberg-related data. and we capture and map appropriate and working capital usage. So receivable days, payable days, what is the absolute number and the average number of working capital days in a cycle by industry. So I know if you are a paint industry, what you should be. I know who the best are. I know who the worst are. I can go to any client and tell them, you know what, you're 20% below the worst, and these are the 6 things you could do to get from where you are to where you need to be. I could even tell them who the best is. And I could even tell them what the best company is doing, but then you get into realms of competition. So should I be doing that? We anonymize it today. So I know it. But we anonymize it and we tell customers, this is how far you are from the best or the average in the industry. These are the 4 things you should be focused on if you need to improve this thing. So the last, again, the use of Watson. I told you how Watson was used in diagnostics. We started using Watson and working with it a year ago, as Desmond said, in the context of wealth management. Now, you think about how banks provide wealth management. It's actually quite rudimentary. We have a team of research analysts and some bright people, fixed income, equity, commodities. They come into work at 6 in the morning. They read everything that they can lay their hands on. So they see what happened to the American markets and the European markets and multiple asset classes. And by 7:30 or 8, they come up with 4 or 5 big views on what is likely to happen and what are our views on different asset classes. We run a conference call at 7:30 with all of our bankers and wealth people around the world, and we tell them the 4 or 5 big views. Right? So go long US, short gold. Right? These are big views. These 600, 800 relationship managers, then through the day, are constantly talking to our clients, and depending on how good the relationship manager is, they either do some finer segmentation to figure out which clients are relevant and which are not, or they just talk to anybody who calls, or they call anybody. And they effectively push those same 5 views. Now, these are intelligent views, they're thought-through views, but the 5 broad views around 5 asset classes now being transferred to, we have 300,000 clients in that space, and that's how we say, okay, this is what you should be looking at doing. So we talk to the client, client's judgment comes into place, we know the client well, but it's very rudimentary. What does Watson do? Watson, every day today in our pilot, is reading 1,200 pieces of research that we feed it through the night. It reads from Bloomberg, it reads from every kind of research this thing you can go to, and Watson reads it instantly. Watson, therefore, doesn't have 5 views. Watson has 100 views on every specific asset class, what happened, and Watson builds a probability weighted. Suppose Watson reads 5 reviews, and 3 people think the US stocks are going to go up, 2 things are going to go down. Watson weights it by the accuracy of the forecaster, the track record, the relative weightage, the timeliness of the forecast. And Watson comes up with a far more intelligent, weighted, probabilistic view of what is good, intelligent advice. Then Watson also goes and reads those 300,000 clients of mine, the entire profile. It reads what you said you like to do. It reads what you said your risk profile was. It reads what you did in the past. Did you buy some kinds of products? Did you not buy some products? Did you try to exit some products? It reads your such situation, your age, do you have kids? And we feed in logic. So if you want to sell insurance, we say check the age, check how many kids, check if they have insurance, and then determine are they likely to need insurance. Watson puts all this together and comes up with a match and comes up with a set of recommendations which is client specific for every client. Right? And say if you talk to this client, these are the 3 things you should be talking to the client about. It is exponentially more intelligent, smarter, and specific than anything we were able to do in the past. So it took us time, it took us a year to train Watson. We've just launched the pilots last month in December. Our early feedback from our bankers is that the Watson recommendations are specific, accurate, and much better than anything they could have come up with themselves. Right? If this works over the next few years, there's no reason why we won't take this and put it online. And so when you log in, you can check yourself and say, what does Watson tell me I should be doing with my data? Watson also allows you to do peer comparisons. So what do other people like you think? And what do the best investors and portfolio managers think? And so you can feed all of this stuff. Now, you could argue all of this is, private information. But in reality, for you as an investor or you as a client of the bank, it will result in superior outcomes, much better use, and far more intelligent and thoughtful advice from a bank. So when you get back to this, my second premise, that in reality, even if you could control a lot of this information, the usefulness of this information is immense. And you can see that today. You see scoring on propensity, people's propensities. You see scoring on people's degrees of social influence. You see scoring, you take Uber or you take Airbnb. You see scoring on, is this guy a good passenger? Is this guy a good chauffeur? And is this guy a good tenant for a house? Right? Those are not bad things. So the third premise, that I think since, you think about the three issues, right? I sort of defined them: security, Jacqueline talked about data protection, fairness, and privacy. And I think they're all challenges. In security, there's no question. Inadvertent leakage and use of data has massive consequences. Talk JP Morgan or Standard Chartered or, Sony or Target or anybody. It's not easy. We spend a lot of time, effort, and a lot of money in putting both peripheral defense, ring fencing, the whole range of protection around data. And it's still not enough. I mean, through phishing, social engineering, the crooks are out there getting their hands. They're socially engineering our customers. Right? And so it's quite ironic that while at the same time we're using big data and going digital, I'm complementing that by using old-fashioned means. I call up people and say, hey, the data tells me this, but are you sure it was you? Right, kind of thing. We're now experimenting with more biometric use and seeing how we can use voice and biometric to do additional rounds of security, verification, identification. But it just seems to me that this will continue to be a challenge. Right? There's no question in my mind that the big firms like JP Morgan must have been doing everything I do and more. Right? And despite that, people can get into it. So it's obviously not straightforward. Fairness, I give you the example of credit. The same example extends to insurance and healthcare. And so if you can use big data to determine the suitability of credit and the pricing of credit, right, how does it align with a sense of fairness and making sure people get an equal shot at everything? We've not been able to get our minds to it. We do believe, though, that from a shareholder standpoint, we are paid to make smart business decisions. And therefore, to give a loan knowingly to somebody who the data tells me is going to default in 2 months, would not be a smart thing to do. And so, we do go down that path. Finally, this whole issue of privacy. It's quite interesting to me that even though we put a opt-out button on almost every site we have, only fractions of our customers, decimals, actually choose to opt out in terms of providing the data or using the data or getting inputs from the bank. And that tells me something about the psychology of customers. So customers are concerned about privacy, but there is an acceptance of a reasonable value exchange. And the acceptance of the reasonable value exchange is if they think they get better benefits from the bank in terms of the specific recommendations, ideas, and products that I can give them, or the SMS I can give them saying, hey, I know you use money at your ATM and it gives you a sense of security, or that I can protect your ATM fraud, people are quite comfortable with it. And therefore, this whole sense of privacy has got to be nuanced with what are people really, in the heart of hearts, comfortable with. It takes me to the last thing. I think this thing of, notification and consent is therefore not likely to work because, people basically freely give a consent. I notify people, people don't seem to bother, people freely give consent to views. And on top of that, as Jacqueline said, who all do you go and get consent from? The guy walking past my branch, anybody who, used a credit card at any this thing, debit card from the car. I can't get consent from everybody. And therefore, I think the new paradigm has got to be around the last part of what Jacqueline said, which is social norms and laws to capture context and appropriate use, suitable use. To do that, of course, you're going to have to figure a way that all data is metadata tagged to carry the context in which it was captured, who it was captured by, and the context in which it was captured. And once data can start carrying a tag saying this is the context in which it captured, then you can develop some norms for what is appropriate use of this data. The analogy I think of is, I'm going to give you two. I was going to use gun control, but given the US laws on gun control, it's a little thing. Think about a knife, right? The way I think. So you could put controls on creating a knife or owning a knife, right? But the fact is you don't, because you need knives for all kinds of things, including eating your breakfast. So the controls are really on use of knives. So the knife is okay if it is used in the context of the right thing. The knife is not okay if it's used to go and stab somebody. I think we're going to have to really think of context and use and develop a set of rules and norms in society around context and use of data. And as we think of our own situation in the bank, that is the mantra we're using. That as long as we can feel comfortable that our customer will recognize the value of what we are doing and why we are doing. We can look at the customer in the eye and make the customer gets benefit and a true value exchange for what we are trying to use the data for. It will be acceptable and usable. So I'm, reminded of Kranzberg's first law, right? The technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I read an anecdote which I thought was quite interesting. This old lady who went to Fritz Kreisler, the famous violinist, and said, "Your violin makes great sound." And Kreisler said, held the violin to his ear and said, "I don't hear it making any sound." The point is not the instrument, it is what you do with it. And so thank you.